The night Marilyn Monroe sang Happy Birthday to President John F. Kennedy, cameras flashed from every angle, capturing what would become one of the most iconic moments in American history. But what those published photographs didn't show were the dozens of other shots taken that night, images the Secret Service found too politically dangerous to release. Those missing photographs joined a growing collection of Marilyn Monroe materials that Hollywood and Washington decided the public shouldn't see. Milton Greene, Marilyn's photographer and closest friend, shot hundreds of frames between 1955 and 1957, capturing her in her bathrobe, drinking coffee, rehearsing without makeup, living the unfiltered life behind the carefully constructed image. One entire roll disappeared during a studio move, only to surface decades later in a Paris collection, selling for $75,000. Meanwhile, in Fox's vault, a tape recorder held Marilyn's voice describing Clark Gable as brilliant but ruthlessly self-critical, observations the studio deemed too dangerous for her manufactured persona. That recording has never been officially released. Before we dive deeper into the archives Hollywood tried to bury, please subscribe. What you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about Marilyn's final years. In July 1962, Marilyn Monroe sat in her Brentwood home for what would become the last extensive interview of her life. The journalist from Red Book arrived with standard questions about upcoming films. What Marilyn gave him instead was 2 hours of brutal honesty about the studio system. She spoke about prescription medications prescribed to keep her working through exhaustion, then prescribed again to help her sleep. She described impossible standards requiring her to maintain a specific weight, a specific look, a specific personality that had nothing to do with who she actually was. She talked about executives who treated actresses like inventory, directors who saw her only as a body to be photographed, an industry that had created a persona slowly erasing the real woman underneath. The reporter listened, increasingly uncomfortable as Marilyn's voice grew tired and raw. She wasn't performing anymore. There was no breathy laugh, no calculated pause. This was Norma Jean talking, using Marilyn's voice to finally tell what it felt like to live inside the fantasy. When the journalist returned to his office, he knew they had a problem. The tape contained career-destroying admissions about studio practices, specific names of executives who exploited her, details about pharmaceutical dependency that would shatter the image millions cherished. Red Book's editorial board made their decision within 48 hours. The interview would not be published. The tape would go into their vault. For 3 weeks, Marilyn continued working, struggling, taking the pills that were supposed to help but were destroying her. On August 5, 1962, she was found dead, a bottle of Nembutal nearby, questions already multiplying. Red Book said nothing about the interview they'd locked away. As the world mourned, as conspiracy theories emerged, the one recording that captured her actual state of mind in those final weeks remained hidden in a Manhattan storage facility. The tape sat there through the 60s, through the 70s, through emerging revelations about Hollywood's abusive practices. It wasn't until 1982, 20 years after Marilyn's death, that Red Book finally decided the world was ready to hear what she'd actually said. When the interview finally appeared, the magazine tried to explain why they'd suppressed it for 2 decades, but what they didn't explain was even more disturbing. In spring 1953, Marilyn Monroe arrived in Buffalo to film Niagara, the movie that would establish her as more than background decoration. What audiences saw was the finished product, carefully lit and expertly directed. What they didn't see was happening between takes. A camera operator, fascinated by the contrast between Marilyn's on-camera presence and off-camera personality, began filming everything. He captured her shivering by the falls between takes, joking with crew about how studios always required thin dresses in cold weather. He filmed her fixing her own lipstick, chatting about her divorce from DiMaggio, rehearsing without the sultry walk directors always requested. When filming wrapped, that footage went into Universal's archives with hundreds of other reels. Someone labeled it, filed it, forgot about it. Years passed. Marilyn became the biggest star in Hollywood, died tragically, transformed into a cultural icon. The footage of her actual personality remained mislabeled and overlooked. It wasn't until 1990, nearly 40 years later, that an archivist doing inventory noticed a canister labeled incorrectly. When he watched it, he realized he'd found something extraordinary. The footage showed a completely different woman from the persona everyone knew. Marilyn laughed naturally, not the calculated giggle of her roles. She moved without the exaggerated hip swing directors choreographed. She spoke intelligently about technical filming aspects. Most striking was a sequence where she sat alone during lunch, reading a book, looking at the falls with genuine wonder that had nothing to do with performance. Historians described it as the most authentic glimpse of Marilyn ever captured, precisely because it was never meant to be seen. But the Niagara footage wasn't the only major discovery hidden in Hollywood's vaults. What emerged from Life magazine's archives would prove even more politically sensitive. On May 19, 1962, 15,000 people packed Madison Square Garden for a Democratic fundraiser celebrating President Kennedy's upcoming 45th birthday. Everyone was waiting for one moment: Marilyn Monroe singing Happy Birthday. Behind the scenes, Life magazine photographers had special access to document the preparation, sensing this would be historically significant. What they captured was far more revealing than anyone expected. The photographs showed Marilyn being sewn into a dress so sheer and tight it had to be stitched onto her body. Flesh-colored fabric covered in rhinestones, designed to create the illusion she wore almost nothing. Life documented everything: Marilyn standing still while seamstresses worked, her expression distant, the dress adjusted to fit like second skin, her looking in the mirror, understanding exactly what statement this would make. They photographed her in the corridor waiting for her cue, practicing the breathy whisper. They captured her face seconds before she walked out, a complex mixture of performance preparation and something that looked almost like resignation. When Marilyn stepped into the spotlight, photographers continued shooting. From their vantage point in the wings, they observed President Kennedy's reaction, the way he leaned forward. They photographed moments after she finished, when the performance smile dropped and her actual face showed through. They captured Robert Kennedy watching from a different section, his own complex reaction. Life's photographers took over 200 shots that night, documenting every aspect of an event that would become one of the most analyzed moments in American history. Back at Life's offices, editors recognized they had a problem. Many photographs were too revealing, not of Marilyn's body but of actual dynamics at play. Images of her being sewn into the dress suggested calculation that undermined the spontaneous appeal the public believed was natural. Kennedy's reaction showed something too personal. Photographs before and after revealed emotional toll behind the performance. Most problematic were shots appearing to show Marilyn and Robert Kennedy in conversation, their body language suggesting familiarity that would fuel decades of speculation. Life published carefully curated images of the performance itself, safe shots matching the official narrative. Everything else went into archives, marked sensitive, access restricted. When the Secret Service learned about unpublished photographs, they reportedly requested certain images never be released. Life complied. For 43 years, the majority remained locked away. It wasn't until 2005 that Life finally opened their complete archive from that night, showing a much more complex story than the iconic moment everyone remembered. While Life was hiding politically sensitive photographs, Marilyn's closest friend was about to lose an entire collection that captured something Hollywood had never seen. Milton Greene met Marilyn in 1953 when he was one of New York's most sought-after photographers and she was transitioning to genuine star. Their professional relationship evolved into genuine friendship, built on mutual respect and shared understanding of how images could be both constructed and authentic. Between 1955 and 1957, Greene photographed Marilyn more extensively than anyone else, creating a visual record ranging from formal portraits to intimate, unguarded moments. He captured her reading scripts, drinking coffee in her kitchen, rehearsing in sweatpants without makeup, existing in ways that had nothing to do with being the icon. Greene understood something many contemporaries missed. The most powerful images weren't always the most carefully constructed. Sometimes revelation happened in moments between poses when the subject forgot the camera was there. He would shoot Marilyn getting ready for formal sessions, then keep shooting after they ended, catching her as she relaxed, removed the performance, became herself. Those transitional moments produced some of his most extraordinary work. In early 1957, Greene loaded fresh film and spent an afternoon documenting Marilyn in her most natural state. She was between projects, living in a small New York apartment, studying with Lee Strasberg. Greene captured her in a bathrobe, discussing Stanislavski technique, cooking breakfast, reading newspapers, doing mundane activities normal people did, but stars supposedly didn't. He shot her answering phones, applying cold cream, falling asleep with scripts. The entire role was intimate without being sexual, revealing without being exploitative, documenting humanity that had nothing to do with Hollywood. When the shoot ended, Greene labeled the canister and stored it with his archives. But during a studio relocation in late 1957, that particular role disappeared. Greene searched everywhere, contacted movers, tried to trace what happened. The film was simply gone. He had other photographs from that period, but those specific moments existed only in his memory. Greene eventually accepted it as unfortunate accident. He died in 1985, still wondering what happened. Then in 2003, a Paris collector contacted a Marilyn memorabilia expert. He'd purchased vintage photography equipment from an estate sale and found a roll of developed negatives featuring what appeared to be Marilyn in completely unfamiliar poses. When examined, specialists recognized them as Greene's lost work. The images were exactly as he'd described: Marilyn unguarded, natural, fully human. They showed extraordinary intelligence and vulnerability, someone completely different from the breathy blonde of film roles. The Paris collector sold those negatives for $75,000, but what they revealed about Marilyn was priceless, and what they suggested about how many other lost archives might exist was even more disturbing. In summer 1960, Marilyn traveled to Nevada to film The Misfits, a project representing everything she'd fought for in Hollywood. The script was written specifically for her by husband Arthur Miller, designed to showcase dramatic range rather than physical appeal. The cast included Clark Gable and Montgomery Clift, and Fox saw opportunity to reposition Marilyn as a serious actress. They also saw a chance to create promotional material. Fox's publicity department arranged an extensive on-set interview to be recorded for radio and press. The interviewer was instructed to ask about working with legendary actors, thoughts on dramatic roles, appreciation for Miller's writing. What actually happened was completely different. Marilyn, exhausted from brutal desert heat and struggling in her deteriorating marriage, started answering with devastating honesty. Asked about Gable, she didn't give expected praise. Instead, she talked about how he reminded her of actors who were brilliant but ruthlessly self-critical, destroying themselves trying to maintain impossible standards. She spoke about watching Gable chain-smoke between takes, seeing the toll decades in Hollywood had taken, recognizing that same destructive pattern in herself. The interviewer let the tape run. Marilyn continued, talking about the pressure of being married to a serious intellectual when Hollywood still saw her only as a body. She described the impossible position of trying to prove she had depth while the industry kept casting her to play dumb. She admitted medications for anxiety and insomnia were making it harder to remember lines, harder to maintain performance standards. She said things about the studio system, about specific executives, about exploitation built into every contract that were absolutely true but completely unpublishable. When the publicity team reviewed the tape, they recognized they couldn't use any of it. Marilyn had essentially confessed to drug dependency, marital problems, and deep disillusionment while speaking about Gable in ways suggesting he suffered similar issues. If released, the tape would destroy promotional campaigns and damage Marilyn's public image. Fox locked the recording in their archives and pretended it didn't exist. Clark Gable died of a heart attack weeks after filming Wrapped. At 59, his body worn from decades of smoking and stress, Marilyn attended the funeral and reportedly told friends she'd warned everyone Gable was pushing too hard, that she'd seen the signs. But she never mentioned the interview where she'd spoken about exactly that dynamic, because officially that interview didn't exist. The tape remained in Fox's vault through Marilyn's own death in 1962, through decades of speculation, through countless documentaries trying to understand what she was experiencing. As of today, that recording has never been officially published. While Fox was suppressing Marilyn's observations about Clark Gable, another pattern was emerging that would prove the studio system had been hiding her voice for years. During the 50s, standard practice for celebrity interviews involved magazines sending questions to studio publicity departments who arranged for stars to provide answers with a publicist present. The resulting interview would be submitted back for approval, giving executives opportunity to edit, revise, or completely rewrite anything that didn't serve their interests. This system was so normalized that journalists accepted it as how Hollywood worked. What most didn't realize was how extensively studios used this power, often transforming genuine interviews into pure fiction. In Marilyn's case, the gap between what she said and what appeared in print was enormous. Researchers comparing original transcripts with published versions found consistent patterns. Whenever Marilyn discussed serious topics, her words were edited to sound frivolous. When she mentioned books or ideas, those references were removed and replaced with comments about fashion. If she expressed frustration with roles or the industry, complaints were transformed into grateful praise. Published interviews presented a Marilyn who was sweet, dizzy, endlessly grateful. The real Marilyn in original transcripts was thoughtful, often angry, desperate to be taken seriously. One striking example emerged from a major women's magazine archive. In 1956, they sent a journalist to interview Marilyn about her move to New York and studies with Lee Strasberg. The original transcript showed Marilyn speaking passionately about wanting serious dramatic roles, studying Chekhov and Ibsen, frustration that directors only saw her as commodity. She talked about feeling trapped in a persona, making her rich but destroying her sense of self. She said she sometimes didn't recognize herself in photographs, that Marilyn Monroe had become something separate from Norma Jean Baker. When the studio received the transcript for approval, they rewrote almost everything. Comments about dramatic roles became praise for comedy work. Discussions of serious literature were replaced with fashion magazines. Her admission about not recognizing herself became a cheerful anecdote about being surprised how good photographers made her look. The published interview bore almost no resemblance to what Marilyn actually said, but it carried her name and photograph, so readers assumed they were getting her authentic voice. This pattern repeated across dozens of interviews throughout the 50s, creating a documented public persona that had almost nothing to do with the actual woman. The practice only came to light years after Marilyn's death, when researchers began accessing studio archives and comparing materials. What they discovered was systematic voice suppression that prevented Marilyn from ever really speaking to her public. The woman millions thought they knew was largely a studio construction. The real Marilyn's voice revealed someone far more complex, intelligent, and troubled than the image Hollywood sold. The systematic rewriting explains why so many were shocked when lost recordings emerged, but there was one more revelation that would change everything. When you assemble all the suppressed materials, the lost footage, the hidden recordings, the rewritten interviews and classified photographs, a completely different portrait emerges. The woman in these archives isn't the dizzy blonde of legend. She's a serious actress, fighting an industry determined to reduce her to a body. She's an intelligent woman constantly having her words rewritten to sound less threatening. She's a vulnerable person struggling with addiction while the system that created her dependency tries to pretend it doesn't exist. Most importantly, she's someone who tried repeatedly to tell her truth, only to have that truth suppressed, altered, or hidden until decades after her death. The Red Book interview locked away for 20 years captured Marilyn speaking honestly about pharmaceutical dependency and studio exploitation. The Niagara footage mislabeled for 40 years showed a woman completely different from her screen persona. Life's photographs classified for 43 years revealed construction behind moments the public believed were spontaneous. Milton Greene's lost role that resurfaced in Paris documented the woman between performances. The Fox recording that has never been released contains her observations about how Hollywood destroys its stars. The systematically rewritten interviews show how thoroughly studios controlled her voice. Together, these materials tell a story Hollywood spent decades preventing anyone from hearing. They document an industry that created an image so powerful it eventually destroyed the woman behind it, then spent years hiding the evidence of what they'd done. The tragedy isn't just that Marilyn died young. The tragedy is that even when she was alive, her actual voice was being systematically suppressed. She tried to tell people what was happening. She sat for honest interviews that got locked in vaults. She lived unguarded moments captured on film, then forgotten. She made observations that were recorded and classified. She existed as a complete, complex human being, but the system kept presenting a simplified, sexualized fantasy instead. Only now, as these lost archives finally surface, are we beginning to hear what Marilyn Monroe was actually trying to say. The materials that have emerged answer some questions about her final years, but raise more about what else might still be hidden. How many more recordings remain in studio vaults? How many more photographs sit in private collections? How many more interviews were rewritten so thoroughly that even original transcripts were destroyed? The archives suggest the full story, told in her actual voice using her actual words, may never be completely known. Too much was suppressed, altered, deliberately hidden. What makes these discoveries particularly significant isn't just what they reveal about Marilyn, but what they suggest about how many other stars had their voices suppressed, their truths hidden, their experiences erased. Marilyn's case is unusual only because she was famous enough that people kept looking for the missing pieces. How many less famous actors had their honest interviews rewritten, their vulnerable moments destroyed, their attempts to speak truth systematically silenced? The lost recordings aren't just historical curiosities. They're evidence of a system that valued image over truth, profit over humanity, fantasy over reality. They document what happens when an industry becomes so powerful it can simply erase the parts of a person's story it finds inconvenient. And they remind us that the voices we hear from the past are often the ones someone in power decided to let us hear. The real voices, the honest ones, the ones that told uncomfortable truths, those were the ones they locked in vaults, hoping no one would ever find them. But people did find them. And now, finally, we can hear Marilyn Monroe speaking in her own voice, telling her own truth, being fully herself. It took decades, but the recordings they tried to hide are finally being heard.